So Judges 11, we're going to look through quite a few different verses, but I'd like to begin by reading at verse 29, and we'll go through verse 33. Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand, and he struck them from Aroer to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel Keramim, with a great blow, so the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Now, let me give you a little bit of background to this story. Jephthah, as a young man, was rejected by his half-brothers because his mother happened to be a prostitute. And so his father had sons through his wives, and then he also had Jephthah through this prostitute. And so because they rejected him, and they drove him out of the house, he left home as a young man, and he joined together with some other, if you want to call them outcasts, people who kind of lived on the fringes of society and kind of had to make their ways in rough ways, had to make their living in rough ways. Verse 3, then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob, and worthless fellows. So that's a kind of an interesting Hebrew phrase. It's really talking about people that on the edge of criminality and maybe cross that line sometimes. People who have not really great character, people who are violent, whatever. Worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. So that's how the story starts. You've got the Israelites and you got Jephthah and his crew of guys. And then the Ammonites. So these are the enemies, long-term enemies of Israel. They attack Israel. And suddenly they went from rejecting Jephthah to needing someone like him who was used to fighting, used to violence. That's in verse 6. And they said to Jephthah, come, be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites. But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress? And I'm kind of cutting a lot of material out just for the sake of time tonight, but eventually they convince him to come, and they tell him, if you lead us and you defeat the Ammonites, we'll make you our ruler. And so they convinced him, and so that's when he made that vow we just read a few moments ago. And as we also read, God gave him a great victory. He defeated the Ammonites, but then when he finally returns home, something happens. Verse 34, then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances, because she's heard that he's had a victory, right? She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And what surprises a lot of readers today is that his daughter didn't start yelling at him, why would you do something that dumb? Or take off the other way running, right? She told him he needed to honor his vow. She agreed. But the thing she asked is that first, she wanted some time to mourn, 2 months specifically, because she was never going to get married. That's in verse 36. She said to him, my father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites. So she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions. So he said, go. Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. So, there are two questions that I want to ask, and they're in your outline. Number one, did Jephthah actually kill his daughter to fulfill his vow to God? Because the Bible seems to say that, right? And number two, if he did that, then why did God accept something that he had forbidden? I mean, child sacrifice was against the law of Moses. Look at Deuteronomy 12, verse 31. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, talking about nations around them, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. So the Bible is really clear. That's just one verse. There's several more where it expressly, clearly forbids child sacrifice. And yet, somehow, in spite of that, if you go over to Hebrews chapter 11, which is God's hall of fame in the Bible, somehow Jephthah made it into that hall of fame. Look at verse 32. What more shall I say? Hebrews 11. For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, and it talks about what these men did, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. So you can see why Jephthah's story is something that Christians have struggled with through the years. Because here you've got this man who has this tragic background, right? It's not his fault who his mother was. And yet his own brothers throw him out of their home because they tell him, you're not going to have any part of our family. And suddenly here he has the chance to do something significant. His formerly estranged brothers come and start begging him, please come lead us, come help us, because we're about to be destroyed. And so he's got this chance to do something amazing, but he makes what seems to be a very foolish vow. In fact, depending on what version of the Bible you read, sometimes they have little title headings, and many of them will say Jephthah's foolish vow. And he makes this seemingly foolish vow, and it apparently costs his daughter her life, and yet we read in Hebrews 11, God gives him credit for it. He essentially says Jephthah did the right thing. Or, is there another way to interpret Jephthah's story? And there are some clues in the text that suggest maybe Jephthah's daughter wasn't sacrificed as an offering, so to speak, to God and died, that maybe something different happened. And the first thing I want to talk about is this. Jephthah does not appear to be just some ignorant guy who just spoke up and made this foolish vow. He appears to be, and we're not going to read it because it would just take way too long, but he appears to be familiar with the law of Moses. Because if you go through the story in Judges 11, what happens is, before Jephthah does anything to the Ammonites, who are the ones invading Israel, he talks to them. He confronts them and he asks them, why are you taking this land? Why are you trying to take this land when we've been here for hundreds of years and it's well established to be Israelite land, Jewish land? And they make the argument that the land belonged to them. It was rightfully theirs. And again, if you can go back and read the story, and he walks them through the history of what actually happened. And if you compare what Jephthah says, it's almost an exact duplication of what you read in the book of Numbers, where the original story is told. And so it appears Jephthah knows the Bible, especially the book of Numbers. And so if Jephthah knew the book of Numbers, then he would have known this verse, Numbers 30, verse 2. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So Jephthah would have known You don't just make a vow to God lightly, carelessly. God will hold you responsible. And so Jephthah knows the word. And then also, it seems like his daughter was familiar with God's word. That's back in Judges 11, verse 36. She said to him, my father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites. So, his daughter knows the law. She knows you keep your word to God. You don't just make some promise lightly. And so, if Jephthah knew the law, which it appears he does, he would have known that the law of Moses forbade child sacrifice, and that the penalty for anyone who practiced child sacrifice was death by stoning. That's in Leviticus 20, verses 1 and 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, that's a false Ammonite god, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. So that's the penalty. You kill a child as a sacrifice to some god, you're going to get killed. So this part of the story doesn't make sense. Jephthah knew God's law. He quotes it almost verbatim when he's talking to the Ammonites. So why would he, knowing what the law said, why would Jephthah disobey God's law to obey God's law? It's illogical. They don't go together. And at least in my view, the answer is actually that this isn't something that Jephthah would have done. So that's the first thing. Jephthah knew the law. He knew you didn't break your vow. He knew you didn't sacrifice your children. He knew that if you did, you would give up your own life. The second thing I want to bring up has to do with and I'm getting a little technical here, and excuse me, but sometimes you got to do it, a technical detail of the Hebrew language. So, in the English language, a conjunction, grammatically speaking, is a word that joins two parts of a sentence. Okay? So I could say, Chip sang a song, and, that's the conjunction, Indio danced a dance. Whether that happened or not, I can't say. But the word and is a conjunction. It's a small word that joins two parts of a sentence. And in English, we have a lot of conjunctions. There's several of them. Each have their own word. But in Hebrew, let me just give you an example. The English language has, at last I checked, somewhere around 600,000 words, which is a lot. Biblical Hebrew has 8,000. Modern day Hebrew has 100,000. So English has got 8 times as many words even as modern day Hebrew. So a lot of their words are shortened, and they have to serve multiple functions, and so their conjunctions are not even words by themselves. If you're writing a Hebrew sentence and you need a conjunction like and or but or with, you actually add a letter at the beginning of the word that's coming next. And in most cases, that letter is the Hebrew letter Vav. We would say it V-A-V, Vav. And it's a conjunction. And there's only 2 or 3 conjunctions in Hebrew at all. Vav is the main one. It can mean and, but, so, then, and or. And the only way you know how to translate it into English is by looking at the context. So where a vav appears, it could mean and, it could mean or, it could mean but, it could mean again with. Just depends on how it's being used, and you have to figure it out. Why am I saying this? Why are we getting into the details? Because Judges 11:31 is typically translated in most English Bibles, it will surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. But that little word and in English is actually in Hebrew a vav. You could, without violating the tenets of Scripture or the principles of accurate translation, you could translate Judges 11:31 like this. Then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering. It's a letter Vav. How do you translate it? Depends on the context, but it can mean or. And so if that's what Jephthah meant, and I believe it was, here's how that would have worked. Now on the third page of our outline, you'll see a little illustration. And that's a typical Jewish house from the first century, but Jephthah's house would very likely have been something similar, even though it was many years earlier. Typically, in those days, the way people would build their houses, unless they were very wealthy and had the money to do multiple buildings, many houses had a lower level. We would call it a basement or a cellar, but it was accessible from the back. You could walk up into it. And at nighttime, depending on how much livestock they had, they would keep their livestock in that first level of their house. Again, it wasn't an area where people went typically except to take care of the livestock. Well, why would you put livestock in the basement of your house with a back entrance? Well, number one, to prevent theft. In the nighttime, your sheep are wandering around or even sleeping. Some enterprising thief comes along and grabs a lamb or two, and guess what? You just got robbed. But if you could keep them in your house, again, not talking about a huge amount of livestock, but just a few, you could keep them there and they'd be safe. And number two, in the winter weather, it gets cold in Israel. And so when real bad weather came in, you would take the most vulnerable of your animals and you would put them under your house. And this is actually especially relevant right now with the Christmas season and the Christmas story of Mary and Joseph and a manger. I won't get into all that, but you kind of get that. That's where that picture came from, actually the story of Christmas, of what it would have been like. So, and this is very likely, because most Hebrew houses were built this way, this is probably how Jephthah's house was. It might have been bigger than the one in that picture I've got there, but there would have been space underneath for animals. And so this is probably what he's thinking. He's saying to the Lord, I'm going to go out and fight the Ammonites, and when I come back, if you give me the victory, this is what I'm going to do. He thought maybe an animal, one of his livestock, would wander out from the house. And that could happen because you could see the picture. Animals were down there. And if that was what happened, in that case, he would have taken that animal that came out first to meet him, and he would have offered it as a burnt offering to the Lord. However, if a human being came out to greet him, maybe thinking of a servant, who knows, then that person would be dedicated to God. Again, let me read how it could be translated. Then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon shall be the Lord's, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering. And so, what does it mean, it shall be the Lord's, if it's not going to be a burnt offering? You remember the story of Hannah praying for a child? And she said, Lord, if you give me a child, if you give me a baby, I will dedicate him to you and he will serve you. And as you remember the way it worked out, she dedicated him and he became an attendant, so to speak, little Samuel, in the tabernacle in the house of God. And that's where he lived. And so Jephthah's daughter would have been dedicated to the Lord in the same way. She would have lived on the property of the tabernacle. She would have been one of the young women who served as a worship attendant in that area, in that facility. And I think that's the case, because let's go to the end of Judges 11, and she's mourning now. These are verses we've already read. I want to go back there. She's mourning what's going to happen to her. But notice the way she mourns. Look at the first part of verse 37. She said to her father, let this thing be done to me. Leave me alone for 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep, watch this, for my virginity. Okay? And then verse 39, at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. Now watch what it adds. She had never known a man. That's what it adds. It doesn't say that he put her to death. So think about that. The Bible never tells us that she went to weep for her death. And I believe it's because she knew she wasn't going to die. Instead, she wept for her virginity. She wept for the fact that she was never going to know a man in the biblical sense where you get married, you have children. And for Jephthah, think about it, that would have been a painful realization for him as well, because what did we read earlier? She was his only child. He'd only had one. And if she never married and never had children, it meant that he would have no grandchildren to carry on his line in a time when family lines were incredibly important. So there's no reason, in my opinion, to believe that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter and that God accepted it. I believe he was simply a desperate man who made a vow to God that God would give him victory over his enemies. And here's what I will do for you, he was saying. And when God gave him the victory, he chose to keep that vow, and his daughter agreed. Father, you said this. You opened your mouth to the Lord, and now you have to keep it. And so hopefully this has given you a different way to think of this story. This is a controversial story. A lot of people are like, boy, what kind of people are you Christians? You believe in a God that, and God approves of child sacrifice. But now you know the background. Now you know something about the language, and now you have some context for understanding. And that's how the Bible works. Even these crazy, difficult stories that we look at them, we're like, what on earth? If you dig deep enough, you're almost always going to find an explanation that not only makes sense to you, but is consistent with what you find elsewhere in God's Word. And so, anyway, I wanted to do that tonight. It's been an interesting study. I remember seeing this years ago, and I've always thought about this story since then. And I just wanted to kind of share that with you. And who knows how discussion will go tonight, but it ought to be interesting. So.